Senator Shaheen, please. Thank you, Senator Fisher.
Thank you, and thank you to each of you for being here today. Mr. Zeikheim, I couldn't agree more about multi-year procurement. It would also help if people could count on our getting a budget done every year. That would be a good first start. So I hope all of us on this committee will take that to heart. Ms. Hill, or Dr. Hill, Belarus has seemingly been reluctant to embrace Putin's war in Ukraine, but Russia continues to use the territory in Belarus to stage its invasion. Can you briefly tell me how Putin views his relationship with Lukashenko and whether we expect Belarus to engage to a greater level in the war in Ukraine in the future?
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. It's actually very important for us to remember Belarus because it still is technically an independent country, but as you're mentioning, it's been used as a staging ground for this conflict by Ukraine by Russia. We also know, of course, that President Lukashenko of Belarus has been in some political difficulty. In the most recent elections there's a lot of questions about whether he was in fact actually elected. We had a large opposition movement that emerged, and there still continue to be questions about his long-term grip on power. What we do know, of course, is that he's become increasingly dependent for political and economic support for Russia, which is why Belarusian territory is now being used. I think Belarus was also a model for what Putin wanted to achieve in Ukraine and still remains so. We've probably forgotten that, several decades ago, Belarus and Russia entered into a union state. Nobody quite knew what that meant, but it was obviously one in which Russia dominates all of Belarus's security policy and politics and economics. And that was clearly what Putin wanted with Ukraine after the initial phases of the invasion. He wanted to do the same thing. So I think that we need to focus on Belarus in thinking forward as well.
Excuse me for interrupting, but so do we think Lukashenko is going to bow to Putin's getting the country further engaged in the war in Ukraine?
I think he has limits to what he can actually do. He's dependent on Putin for propping him up on the one hand, but on the other, he has such a level of opposition. We're seeing Belarusians fighting for the Ukrainians. We've, of course, got a lot of Belarusian opposition in the Baltic states and in Poland and elsewhere. I think Lukashenko knows that if he used the country or let the country be used as a platform for yet another set of invasions of Ukraine and actually then committed Belarusian forces, that he would face severe problems at home. I think all the signs are that he's trying to shift his way towards the exits. I mean, he's been flashing sort of signals behind the scenes that he would like to do something different. The challenge is trying to figure out how to facilitate that under the current circumstances.
Thank you. Given the turmoil in the world right now, are there opportunities that we should be trying to take advantage of? Obviously, in Syria, for example, the devastation of the earthquake has finally allowed or forced Assad to open up some more avenues into the country for humanitarian aid. You talked, I think, Dr. Lynn and Dr. Hill, each of you talked a little bit about the opportunities with some of our Asian partners to get closer together to address China. But are there other opportunities that we ought to be looking at in this turmoil and trying to take advantage of?
I'll just say very quickly, in addition to those that you've outlined, because I think those are genuine opportunities, that we should also take a much harder look at all of the web of our relationships in the Western Hemisphere, for example. One of the issues that we discovered under the last administration when we had the crisis in Venezuela was that regional countries were not well disposed towards the United States, in part because we've failed to have a coherent policy towards our neighbours in Latin and South America. We've focused on problems rather than how we can build those relationships up. And I think with the shift to President Lula in Brazil, this provides more of an opportunity because he's traditionally been much more interested in international affairs. We also have opportunities in Mexico and in other countries to try to work with them looking forward. Our big problem is that 87 countries around the world, including many of our neighbours in Latin and South America, still tend to have visa-free regimes with Russia. They're looking towards Russia and China for investment and sometimes assistance. We could work on that front as well.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator,
Zeikheim.
I just would add that, and I know you do a lot of work on this allies. I mean, there's no better way, to engage allies, and allies more willing to work with us than when you have revanchist powers invading other countries. And they're playing out in terms of what the CCP is doing, and certainly with Russia, you see Finland and Sweden, and then, of course, as was mentioned, what the opportunities we have in the Indo-Pacific. I would add that we need to give these more meat. You know, the AUKUS framework is a great example, but other types of particularly industrial cooperation, how we deal with supply chain challenges in terms of how it impacts the military, we're not making these alliances and relationships meaningful enough for the current security environment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Rounds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you for